Commission that will be speaking from an airport because then he has to leave to Washington. So we have exactly 45 minutes with him. That's why we need to try and be brief also with the questions. Second housekeeper issue. Born Cybert wanted to say that he speaks according to the Chatham House rules. That is absolutely off the record. And now the High Representative is arriving, so we will apply Chatham House rules, so we cannot quote what he said, or you can quote him, but not the source. I hope everyone is in agreement. So we're now going to get started with the first session this morning on the EU in the face of China's emergency. Today we have three super experts on the subject. We will first give the floor to Alice Ekman. She is French. She is one of the European experts on relationships EU-China. She is now senior analyst at the European Institute for Security Studies, and for a long time she's been the head of the Asian department in the French Institute for Foreign Affairs. And then we will have Yves Tiberghien, also from France, even though he is now professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And correct me if I'm wrong, you are the head of the Kai chair, and you're specialized in Asian studies and specifically Japanese studies, and is an expert in political sciences like Alice Ekman. And finally, we will have Eugenio Bregolat. He humbly introduces himself as former Spanish ambassador to Russia and China. And I must say that when an ambassador can say that they've been in Moscow and Beijing, we know what he's going to speak about. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Alice Ekman. And I ask you to please speak for a maximum of 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Francisco. Santander is a wonderful city, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Next to Ambassador Bregolat, I remember when I was a young PhD student in Beijing at Tsinghua University, I interviewed Chinese diplomats, but also I interviewed European diplomats, and you were one of the warmest diplomats to welcome a young student. The young student I was, very open in sharing your experience. So I'm very grateful, and the word is very small. I understand that the time is limited, so I will make 3 points to address the topic. The topic of the session is China la EU frente a la emergencia de China. Urgency, right? And la emergencia, sí. Y yo creo que hay 3 important points to keep in mind when we talk about Chinese emergency. First of all, is the level of ambition of China's foreign policy. As we just discussed with Ambassador Bregolat, China's foreign policy has changed a lot. As you know, under Deng Xiaoping, China was keeping a rather low profile in its foreign policy ambition. It was Tao Guangyanghui, so it was keeping a low profile not because China had no ambition, but it was not the time, because China was so poor after the Cultural Revolution that it would be better, not to be too ambitious, to focus on domestic economic development And then later on, when China would have the economic strengths, maybe to pretend to promote more ambitiously its interest in the East and South China Sea. So at the time of Deng Xiaoping, of course, there was not much discussion about South China Sea, not much tension, but it doesn't mean that China had no ambition in respect, but China had no means and no, well, the priorities were different. Then, of course, under Jiang Zemin, there was a start of a go-out policy, as you know, where China started to internationalize its enterprises and be more economically present abroad. And under Hu Jintao, I sum it up very briefly, but it's important to have this background, historical background, when we talk about China's emergency. And then under Hu Jintao, there was very clear ambition in terms of global governance restructuring. Hu Jintao, who was in power from, as you know, 2002 to 2012, considered that it was time to restructure global governance. And he promoted China's, I would say, ambition in the matter in 3 ways. He said, well, it's time to further integrate international organization, UN system in particular. Of course, in 2001, China integrated the WTO and to at least be present in an active way, not just attend as China used to do at the UN, for instance, but really lobby actively its position and interest, and to play the rules of the game in the end to step by step reform the institution from inside. It's not that China is happy with the way international organizations inherited from Bretton Woods were structured, but say, okay, let's integrate them to reform them from inside. So that's one track. Second track that came more under Xi Jinping said that to restructure global governance, you don't only have to to integrate existing institutions, you have to, well, create new institutions. And that's how we got the AIIB, Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank, and that's where also China promoted a third step, is to try to rejuvenate, to make some sense of useless institutions, such as the SICA, conference building mechanism in Central Asia, which did not include US or Japan. I won't be too technical, but just to say that China had, since Hu Jintao, very strong global governance ambitions. And under Xi Jinping, China, under the CPC, considers that it is time now to seize the opportunity, given that China is the second largest economy in the world, to really accelerate the rhythm of diplomatic initiatives to promote further its interest and really promote an alternative global governance system without completely putting on the side the existing one, but again, to restructure it from inside and in parallel outside of it whenever possible or meaningful for China's interest. This means that under Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012, China had a very, very active diplomacy, as you know. In terms of visit, he visited many countries abroad. Of course, all this stopped with COVID, but it resumed. And China is still promoting a very active diplomacy, even if the economy is facing severe difficulties. Diplomatic budget has increased by more than 6%, defense budget, as you know, more than 7% on average every year. But most of all, China considered that this is a priority, to have a very, very ambitious foreign policy, to keep the dynamic running and to keep being at the initiative. When China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in autumn 2013, well, you know, it is an example of setting the tone. You start it, you push it, even if it's not really clearly defined, then you create a forum around it. Even if it's not really successful, then you create a second edition around it. And then COVID came and said, well, you know, no, China's foreign diplomacy is over. No, a third edition will come now in autumn. And China has the ambition, and that's very important, to be a coalition builder now under Xi Jinping, much more than before. Xi Jinping is talking about a Yuan, circle of friends. He said that in a New Year's speech in 2018 already, that China has to enlarge its circle of friends. It's not signing alliance treaty. It's informal cooperation, diplomatic or security cooperation, but that has to be enlarged as much as possible to be able to be a force of coalition at the UN, and sometimes it is winning. On Xinjiang, for instance, the Human Rights Security Council, when a group of 17 countries joined, put forward a text to inquire or to start a debate about the situation in Xinjiang, China managed to gather 19 countries to counter this group of 17 countries. That was more than 1 year ago. So initially we said, well, coalition building, China will not manage to build coalition. You know, China is isolated. It has no formal ally except North Korea on paper. But actually, step by step, on some topics, China is managing to be a coalition builder. At least it's important to, I think, take note of the coalition building dynamics that China is really promoting at a rapid pace. Now, my second point in this context is that Russia is an important pillar of China's coalition building strategy. China-Russia relations is much more than a marriage of convenience. I know there is debates among experts, but I really think we have now the facts and the distance to acknowledge that it's more than a marriage of convenience. The expression became popular in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, and Russia turned east, and analysts were saying, well, Russia is turning east because it has no other option, but in the end, this will not last. It's not a sustainable pivot, if we may say, because China-Russia relation is facing too many limits. You know, sometimes they were mentioning potential competition in Central Asia, demographic issues in Siberia, asymmetries of the economy, because it is the second and the 11th largest economy of the world, and obviously there is a strong asymmetry economically. But since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is clear that China has not initiated any distanciation from Moscow. On the contrary, and I have the figures here, we have clear-cut figures. On the contrary, bilateral trade in 2022 increased by 30% in comparison with 2021. Russia became the largest oil provider of China, ahead of Saudi Arabia. Both countries continued to conduct joint military exercise on a very regular basis. You remember already since 2014 onwards, there was joint military exercise in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic Sea, in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, in Siberia, in Central Asia. And these exercises have been going on even in recent days following the trilateral meetings between Japan and South Korea and the US. China protested with joint maneuver with Russia, naval maneuver near Okinawa. All this to say that, I mean, on China-Russia, there is a lot to say, and I will elaborate in the Q&A if necessary. But we see a lot of signs of rapprochement between China and Russia. At the moment, Chinese partners, think tanks, diplomats, and Chinese interlocutors are reaching out to Europeans to say that they're not happy, not so happy. Well, they don't say that. They say that there is an adjustment, a recalibration of the relationship with Russia. This is through think tank dialogues, for instance, the message that is passed. But when we ask concretely how it illustrates, there is no answer. The only reference is that the term no limits friendship is not appearing in the latest joint declaration that has been published after Xi Jinping's visit to Russia in March 2023. But apart from that, there is a willingness from the Chinese side to convince European partners that there is some adjustment. But in my analysis, this is mostly communication. And at least I'm waiting facts to talk to justify that message or to support that message. And my last point is related to the EU, of course, is to say that in China's coalition building strategy, under Xi Jinping, the EU and Europe as a whole, because as you know, China is promoting a three layers type of engagement with Europe at EU level, at EU member state level, at sub-regional level, while it tried to before with parts of Europe, but also at local level. But to go back to my main point, in this context of coalition building, Europe, whatever the level, is not a priority partner for China. I'm not saying it's not an important partner, but I'm saying in all strategic documents that China is putting forward, the priority partner that is appearing officially, and that is also the region that China is engaging the most with, are so-called the developing countries, or now we say the global south. For instance, the Global Security Initiative that has been launched by China about a year ago, but the concept paper has been published in February, mentioned Africa 14 times, but never mentioned Europe or any EU member states. China sees, of course, Europe as an important economic partner, but in the end, China is ready to pay the price of its coalition building strategy. And in particular, it's willing to pay the price of its prolonged rapprochement with Russia. It is costly in terms of image, in terms of partnership. Of course, EU and new member states have raised question and dissatisfaction regarding China's, at minima, ambiguity regarding its position and lack of condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in the end, I don't think China will adjust its long-term positioning because EU and Europe is seen, and that's, I think, is quite important, is seen as part of the West. China's foreign policy is very much driven by a strong anti-Western resentment. We've never noticed such a strong anti-Western resentment since Mao era. It was not present in such strong terms under Hu Jintao, even less so under Jiang Zemin. Under Xi Jinping, there is clear view that the West as a whole is responsible of crises in the world, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Korean Peninsula to Ukraine, and China now is considering that the US and NATO have been the one provoking the situation in Ukraine, and that it's time for an alternative order to take shape, but also it's time to form this anti-Western coalition building. So it's really, it's about also sentiment, and I dare to say the word, it's about ideology. We can elaborate on this during the Q&A, but it's really important, I think, to consider that China considers us as part of the West, the useful West in some respect. Some member states could be particularly useful in creating transatlantic tension, or at least China hopes that the West will not be, I would say, coordinated in its position, and China hopes that so-called Indo-Pacific strategy will fail. Wang Yi said in his previous and renewed capacity, they said that the US-led Indo-Pacific strategy is a new form of NATO in Asia that is illegitimate and doomed to fail. So I think the mere fact that we Europeans are security allies of the US is an issue for China, and whatever we are doing, we may be useful in one way or another for economic cooperation, for image, but in the long term, we are not priority partner of China, and I don't think seen by Beijing as such, and I don't think that in the long term, economic difficulties that China is facing will change this approach toward us. This was just the ground framing of the topic, and of course I will be welcoming Q&A and listening to my colleagues with great interest.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks a lot, Alice. Creo que tenemos ya muchos elementos para...
Thank you, Alice. I think we have many elements that we can discuss later on, see if things are going to change or not. And I think your presentation will be complemented now with what Eve has to say. Thank you. Good morning.
It's a really great honor being here in beautiful Santander for the first time. I really wish to thank HRVP Josep Borrell for the invitation. Although I come from Canada, I was born in Brittany, France, which shares the Atlantic Ocean with Santander. And I have a street in my name in Brussels, although it's not me, it's an ancestor, of course. So I'm going to see if this works. So I took the big topic of trying to hew advice from Jean Monnet, who said it's very, very important to always think what will be urgent tomorrow. So to try to shape the world in 10 years rather than only react in the short term. So that's why I'm looking in this framework. I should add that although I'm based in Canada, I've been working or living in Asia for 35 years, East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, as well as Indonesia, Myanmar, and India. So this is where I came from on Sunday. Footnote, climate change, super important. The whole of Canada is burning. This is the province where I come from, and this is the sunrise I had before taking the float plane to come here. And all of British Columbia is burning. It's pretty shocking how early this is, 2023. We didn't think it would happen until 2030 or more. So context, just a little wake up, a few things on China today. We have all heard about the youth unemployment. This is very tragic, something very serious going on here. Other sign that something profound is happening is the fall of births. We actually around 7-8 million births this year in 2023. This is the trend. And it has really been collapsing. At the bottom, I put a picture of Qigong, something that affected the HRVP personally since he disappeared after just 6 months in the job. And it's indicative of pretty profound factional fights even today under Xi Jinping's control. What's also important is Qigong was a protege of Xi Jinping, fast-tracked into the job and then crashed out of the job, showing that something pretty serious is happening. The other graph is EV. 26% of new cars sold in China now are electric vehicles. And they produce and over half of all the EVs in the world. So it's a critical story on the climate side. And then I put two of the books that just came out in the last year. One by Robert Lighthizer on how the US has pushed back so aggressively against China. The other one on Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, on how we are now running the risk of an avoidable war, world war. So just a few pointers of the debates today about China. This is another pointer. I always take the Singaporeans as important bellwethers because the Singaporeans are, super smart, super well-trained, and they're in the heart of the region, the Indo-Pacific region. This is the interview with Farid Zakaria just a few days ago. And he said, first of all, he observed that the US now is engaged in strategic competition, but actually extreme competition, and he's very worried about it. Second, he said that this creates a tit-for-tat dynamic where every step by one side is leading to retaliation by the other side. And I'll put this very forward immediately on the table. Pretty much everything we study about China now has to be understood in the context of tit-for-tat cycles of interactions. Everything is interactive. And we cannot understand the moves taken by China today without looking at the interactions with the US over the last 10 years. And so he also said, if this gets out of hand, this tit-for-tat interaction, it will be a lot of trouble for Singapore, a lot of trouble for the whole world. And then finally, he says, remember that China's sheer size and scale today is much larger than the Soviet Union was. And of course, Russia, 10 times more than Russia. And so it's literally impossible to think of sanctions the same way we did with Russia. It would destroy the global economy, essentially. So those are a few pointers to start with. The questions I want to look at is first, always start with an evaluation. Where is China's trajectory heading on multiple dimensions? And what's happening with the political tightening or hardening that we see. Second, how high are the stakes and the risks over Taiwan, risks of war. In terms of global order, is the global order in danger? I'm actually, by training, a political economist, so I've done a lot of work on G20, but also on environmental governance, biodiversity, climate, and the like. So I look at that as well as trading system, financial system, but also the security system. Is it completely up for grab? What's holding, what's not? And then causality, what is driving all this? And I want to look at different hypotheses, show different ways to think about it. And those different ways all carry some of the weight. And then finally, what should the EU do about all this? So I have several arguments, first at the global level, then short term, and then what the EU should do. First argument, Chinese governance is clearly hardening. And traditional pragmatism and strategic behavior that we saw for a long time since Deng Xiaoping is often, but not always, overridden by power play, power concentration by Xi Jinping, ideology, and domestic security behavior. So something very, very important is a very different China from even 5 years ago. Second, however, Chinese hardening doesn't explain everything that we see. So it's often overplayed because there's other components to explain the behavior. We also are going through an interregnum, a power interregnum, a great transition. In fact, it's the greatest global power transitions in over a century. I'll show you data about this. 22% global GDP have changed hands in 20 years. And in history, that's why we have all the books on hegemonic transition in IR theory. In history, no transition of this scale has happened either peacefully or without major change in the global order. So in a way, we had Steve Wall, the famous IR realist, saying, whatever we think about China or Chinese governance, the power itself, the power shift itself explains a lot of the problems we have. And of course, the hegemonic transition between US and China is sucking out a lot of oxygen on the discussion about global order. It's like a vortex that captures everything. And it's predicted by IR theory. Also, in addition, we have rising nations all over the world, non-Western nations, beyond China. They're all recovering their voices in a post-colonial world, and they expect more say in shaping rules and to have more voice. We can only save the global order if we value a lot of its components by knowing how to work with them in a novel way, non-colonial, post-colonial way. In addition to all this, we also face some of humanity's greatest systemic risks at the same time, climate and AI. We have a lot of AI top analysts and experts who are calling our attention this year, saying that humanity could be endangered if we don't find a global way to govern AI. This is very, very serious. We also have an acceleration of weaponized economic policies, weaponized interdependence, that can lead to a disintegration of the global economy. And so I would argue here that global cooperation of some kind is a condition for human survival. This conforms with the findings of a coalition of think tanks I created, Vision 20, and we had a bunch of summits, at the Berlin Global Solutions Summit in the US, in Argentina around the G20, even in Hangzhou in 2016 around the G20. In terms of the short term, we have several accelerators. First of all, I agree with Alice on this. The Chinese overreach and extreme ideological turn in 2022, I would argue, in fact, erased all of the soft power gains in the Indo-Pacific that China had done over 10 years. And it has opened great space for the US to score great points, and it just did. For example, the Korea-Japan-US rapprochement is a huge coup for the US, huge victory. Second, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a huge destabilizer. China is locked, here I have a slight difference with Alice, in a defensive relation with Russia. The main logic is why, that China once put it that way, why should I help you defeat my friends so that then you put all your energy in beating me up? So it's a fearful, at the heart of it is a visceral fear of being vulnerable to US attack, right, and US coalition. And we, the West, have not yet found ways to incentivize China to give more space in its relationship with Russia. When deep down, you can know from all research on the ground, there's very little trust in Russia from the public or even the elite. And the Director General who led the writing of that declaration on February 4th, the No Limit Partnership, was then demoted in China, and there was clearly frustration with that declaration. Third, Taiwan stability requires a delicate combination of serious deterrence, diplomatic engagement, and forbearance by the major players, China, of course, but also the US and Taiwan. We can bump into a conflict either triggered by China, but also by the US or by, of course, Taiwanese politics. It's a very delicate thing. It's a compromise status quo created by, essentially Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, and it takes that very careful management to maintain it. But a key leg here is deterrence. Japan and the EU can play a key supportive role, but it's a very direct, interactive game. Nothing is set yet. I don't think there's a timetable or a risk for immediate invasion, but it's all a matter of interactions. Fourth, the US political crisis of November 2024 that's coming up with risks of either violence or risk for the judicial system adds enormous uncertainty, and the scenarios out of that are bifurcating, right? Very different worlds can emerge out of that, depending on what happens in the US. And for the EU, that's critical, and it will affect its relation with China. Finally, there's a huge amount of emotion and misperceptions on all sides. Immense emotion on our side, but immense emotions in China too, on social media. And misperceptions. Social media bubbles and framing through historical precedents create tit-for-tat cycles that are not strategic, often very emotional and dangerous. So there's an urgent need for dialogue that can diffuse misperceptions. This is a key finding in a big dialogue that took place in the Berlin Global Solutions Summit last May. So for the EU, the bottom line that has emerged, greatly shown in HRVP Borrell's speech on April 13, the interest of the EU lies in asserting its power and existence at the time of geopolitical conflict, in standing for global rules, pushing back against Chinese infractions, but not going as far as blocking China's rise or triggering war. So this is about search for leverage, de-risking, strategic autonomy, and global rules rather than conflict. This involves, therefore, use of all kinds of leverage, but also a degree of cooperation. Very complex, actually, set of jobs, and it's a very tough job for the HRVP. So I'm going to say a few more things, trying to go fast here. The first thing is we are living in a very unusual time, a time when the order is disrupted by fundamental forces. We have multiple disruptions at the same time. We have crisis, we have long-term disruption, climate, AI, and we have a huge rebalancing of power going on. The closest we have to coordinating the response to disruption is the G20, but it's often fractured and it moves slowly. We rely on institutions, norms, and rules, but they're increasingly challenged by geopolitics. And in a Westphalian world, global governance can only work if the major powers come together, because all powers lies with the sovereign states. So there are exceptions. A few things have progressed, like the Biodiversity Framework Agreement or the High Seas Treaty, and some results of the G20. So those are good. And there are also more unilateral or plurilateral progress that have happened, some of which led by the EU. The problem of interacting disruption at the same time is that it makes modeling very difficult. The Canadian Central Bank governor, the former one, Stephen Pallets, wrote that when there's multiple forces and disruptions at the same time, it compounds uncertainty, and it can complicate all scenario making. And so here is a key graph that's probably the most important that I will present. I'm a political economist. I always start with GDP and power. Economic power in nominal dollar is always the fundamental driver for IR over time, right? This is, of course, a very realist assumption. But look at this. Between 2000 and 2022, the share of the OECD, the advanced economies, have gone from 81% to 59.5%, minus 22 points. The US has gone down, but not very much. The US remains very resilient. Japan has gone down a lot, from 15 to 4. The EU here is complicated because the year 2000 was not a good year, with the euro being too low that year. But so that's why I put the 25, that was the year before, but from 21 to 17. So the G7 has gone down from 71 to 43.5. And that's why there is so much reaction in the global south to G7 leadership, right? Or to control of the IMF, World Bank, and others by G7 countries. They think, you know, we have changed, the developing world has doubled in 20 years, we need more say, more decision power, more voice. The developing world, what we call global south, has gone from 19 to 41. In PPP term, purchase parity is 55. This is a huge change, the biggest change in power since the 19th century, and it cannot be put under the carpet. It requires adjustment. Institutions and global order and global rules cannot survive if it doesn't remain legitimate. To remain legitimate, power distribution has to be adjusted in global organizations. The EU gets that. Canada gets that. We have had more reluctance from the US. In fact, informally in discussion, the US often gets that. Bob Zillick, many others have said it's critical. But politically, it's impossible in the US to talk about adjusting power in global institutions. The Chinese share of GDP is now 18%, but the voting rights of the IMF is 6.2%. So there's a huge gap, right? And by the way, Bob Zillick and others have argued that this is why the AIIB was created. It was a response to the reluctance of adjustment in global organizations. So at least this is one factor that we have to keep in mind. Note that India has doubled, ASEAN has doubled, Russia is flat, flat from 1990, but down from 2000, and Brazil is flat. So interesting how all those pieces are moving. Comparative ratios, you know, the US versus China. China was 7% of the US in 1990 and has reached 76% in 2021, but back down to 71% in 2022. But that's in part due to the renminbi going down. So some of it is a currency effect, but some of it is China shooting itself in the foot with extreme zero COVID in 2022. China versus Japan. When I started teaching 21 years ago, they were equal. Or no, Japan was 4 times bigger than China, and now China is 4 times bigger than Japan. So this is huge adjustments. China versus India, we're still at a ratio of 1 to 5. And then China in the world is now 18%. So those are really big drivers in the global system that have to be dealt with, right, one way or another. And with it come a massive export dependence. This is just export, not the import here. So the EU or US or UK, for that matter, are 10, 11%. Canada is much lower at 4%. But most of Asia is highly connected to China. You know, when you're 25% or so dependent for your exports on China, it's very hard to do hard decoupling. That's why Singapore talks in the way I discussed earlier. But even for Taiwan or Japan, there's a hard coupling here. Oh, this is the percentage of exports going to China from total exports. So for the US, now 9% of all American exports in the world go to China. So that's the dependence on China for exports. So we also have all those shocks at the same time. Very important shock now, the war, US democratic governance, Chinese hardening, you know, the climate and AI, volatility and shocks in the global economy, multipolarization, and global governance in crisis. So these are addition. Something very important for the EU, we're also going through twin industrial revolutions that will completely reshape the order of nations in the 2030s. Depending on the speed of adjustment to green technologies and AI, we will have different ordering of nations in competitiveness in the 2030s. And some countries are ahead in this because they got this long ago. That includes China, but also Japan, Korea. Now India is going fast on this. And the US has jumped into this with the IRA. It's become an industrial policy race. So in that sense, the liberal the liberal paradigm is suffering because the stakes are so high. No one can afford to fall behind, and that's a huge challenge for the EU. And there's the mismatch on global integration and domestic narratives, but I'll go faster. So now China is definitely going through a crisis of internal model. We had a grand bargain of economic stability, prosperity, and social progress in exchange for CCP control. But the society became more cosmopolitan, more modern, asked for more freedom, and the choice was either to institutionalize more and give more space or to harden, and they chose to harden in response. And so we even reached in 2022, the first year since Deng Xiaoping, where the Chinese system made life extremely painful and difficult for the middle class. So they angered the middle class with this extreme zero COVID. There is greater political centralization and harsher rule of the CCP, including all kind of authoritarian rule. And the Chinese economic model is suffering right now with a lot of great shocks, youth unemployment, economic growth falling, deflation, inward FDI tumbling, etc. Now, if we take a longer term, this is a book that just came out, very influential. There's also always a process of iteration and search for solution within the Chinese model. So we may be going through one of these iterations. It's always hard to say how serious crisis is. In terms of an example of how harsh the hardening has been, the response to COVID in 2022 is critical. And I wrote a book partly about this, but in phase 2, there was this very intense response, which was quite similar but harsher to some other response in East Asia. But in phase 3, when Omicron came, instead of opening and adjusting to Omicron, the solution was to crack down even more, to let people go hungry, and harsh border closure, which eventually led to protests. And then there was an abrupt U-turn. And that happened because of politicization. So it was a critical moment where the classic good governance, pragmatic governance that we normally see in China since Deng Xiaoping was overridden by a political effort to get ready for the party congress. And then there was the massive construction of detention center, which scared the public. This was on social media. And it led to protests, which were amazing. They spread through campuses in one afternoon, all over the campuses in China and in many streets. And it led to a critical, very fast change of position. The protests were triggered, but local governments were bankrupt, the economy was in free fall, and there was also diplomatic re-engagement, including with the EU, that helped. So the other huge factor to explain a lot of what we see is the tit-for-tat steamroller of US-China relations that falls under hegemonic transition. And we have moved from a unipolar to multipolar system. This generates a great security dilemma, as per Graham Allison. And fragile politics in both US and China makes this more difficult. For Allison, the only solution to this kind of dilemma is global institutions, global norms, people-to-people and cultural engagement, domestic support from both sides, and support by third and middle power, including the EU in this case. Unfortunately, those things are also being eroded in the US right now. There's no support for those things. So that leads to a great debate between the internal factors within Chinese policy pushing this versus the interactive side. All right, I'm going to close. 1 minute. An important thing here I want to put on the table, someone I respect a lot, Jessica Chen Weiss, great scholar at Cornell, worked in the State Department, and she noted in a Foreign Affairs article last year that it's impossible to have optimal policymaking analysis within the US at the moment because of politicization within the US, where every position taken by analysts is more reflective position in consideration of their career or in consideration of the risk that they may be taking. So this is a very profound understanding that there is groupthink going on, and the same thing even more extreme in China, which makes things more dangerous, right, in the interaction between them. I'll skip that. The implication of this is we can have sudden national misdriven and ideas leading to cycles of acceleration, tit-for-tat interactions, simple heuristics, and potential breakdown. So we have knowns and unknowns about China. It's very important to always think in those terms. What do we know? What we don't know? So I listed some knowns. What we don't know is really the degree of full strategic control of the military. It's hard to make sense of the border war in May 2020 with India without looking at autonomous action by the military because it's strategically stupid. And therefore, it's not a strategic idea. We see economic risk. We see, we don't know how far the willingness is to go with Taiwan. So there's certain unknowns of that sort that, there is strong debates about. For Europe, finally, in conclusion, we need, first of all, an EU collective action. It's very dangerous to have individual pieces of the EU constellation dealing with such a complex country that's in a state of hardening, and it's both harder, more aggressive, and wounded. And China is deeply wounded by the US since the Trump administration. So the reaction there can be secondary reaction that can be taken on the EU, but they're all related to the interaction with the US. So it's very, very important to understand that. There is no realistic option of general decoupling from China or general sanction because it would destroy the global economy due to the sheer size. It's very important to play the long game, strategic long game, and look for leverage and strategic choice. Very important to build tools of deterrence, leverage, power, coalition, to push back on intrusive behavior and be very open about this and very clear and demand reciprocity in the power game because of the assertiveness of China. But long-term diplomacy and incentives are essential, as well as work on cooperative issue. And then finally, again, US politics are a huge variable. Final tips from Jean Monnet. He spent a lot of time in China, 2 years, and this is what he wrote about China, and some of it is still correct. He said, number one, Chinese negotiators are often more sophisticated and complex than Western ones. The key is not to seek full understanding, but to build trust. Make sure that your acts and your words match perfectly. Hypocrisy leads to failure. He wrote a lot about this, actually. Build personal relationship. Be ready to go see a top leader 3 times, because the top leader culturally will say no twice. And then the 3rd time will open the door. You cannot always get direct answers. You must guess. And then don't invest any capital in China without Chinese participation. So those are some of the tips from Jean Monnet, which I thought interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Necesitas o te vienes aquí o esperas el micrófono. Micrófono, por favor. Por favor. El mensaje va dirigido a ti. ¿Ah, sí? Sí. Vamos a ver. A las 11 tenemos que conectar. 11:30. 11:30. Lo digo porque eso está siendo muy interesante y estamos comprimiendo mucho los tiempos y estamos perdiendo partes importantes de las posiciones que se habían preparado. Sugiero que escogemos y si no hay bastante tiempo para la interacción, pues ¿qué le vamos a hacer, no? Pero creo que es importante.
I think it's important to give time to our speakers, and if there's more enthusiasm to carry on debating, then maybe when the next speech is finished, we can carry on. I'm just would like more details. Maybe after the speech that we're going to hear, we could come back and debate further. Let's see if we've got time. It's really important here. It doesn't matter if we don't finish at 12:15, we can carry on dialoguing with our 3 participants here, if necessary. Eugenio, Mr. Ambassador. I don't know if there will be more time afterwards, but it would be great. It's great to be here once again in Santander. It's always very pleasant to come here and to see that the Maddalena Peninsula is still very green and that the Cantabrian Sea is still very blue. and that the Cantabrian Sea isn't on fire, nor has it been emptied, at least for the moment. When we talk about climate, universal climate disasters that have happened this year, immediately you remember the following. Why Joe Biden and Xi Jinping why don't they come together this week? We could invite them to come to Santander. Why don't they come together, meet up with each other, and just leave their differences aside and say, okay, let's lead this universal struggle against climate change and other problems as well, but especially this one, which could actually mean an end to the world. What are they waiting for? Having said that, I'm going to get down to the nitty-gritty. What's happened in China in the last 50 years at the outset was unthinkable, but actually true. It's happened. I'm going to see if I can actually try to reflect what's happened in China over the last half a century. We can accept that the 20th century ended in 1991, which is when the Soviet Union fell, communism came to an end in Russia and in Eastern Europe. Okay, great. That's when the 20th century ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, the 21st century had actually begun before then. It began in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping started the economic reforms of China. I'm going to try to reflect this with two sentences. Firstly, around the year 2000, I was in Hong Kong talking to Peter Bull. Peter Bull is one of the main capitalist investors of Hong Kong. He wields a great deal of power. At that time, he was president of the Trade Development Board of Hong Kong, and he said to me, some compare China with Japan in the 1960s. The difference is that between Peking, Tianjin, and the Shandong Peninsula, Shanghai, and the two neighboring provinces, and in the south, Canton, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and the estuary of the River Burns, there's another kind of Japan. So there are three Japans, and a billion people behind that. Three Japans and a billion people behind that. The issue of China is the dimension of China as far as space goes. And what about time? The World Bank said, I think it was around 10, 15 years ago, perhaps even more than that, that China has in one single generation what most countries have needed centuries to do. China has done in one generation what the most countries have needed generations to do. And what China done had been done by Japan before, and the four dragons too are completely Chinese, which is Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the other is also Chinese, with 75% of the Singapore population being Chinese. And, of course, Taiwan. All of these did that. But these are tiny. The Chinese problem is its dimension. If China was just 10 or 12 countries of about 150 or 200 million inhabitants, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is the dimension that China has, in addition to its proven capacity. We've seen GDP figures. We've seen when Chinese change began in 1978. The GDP of China was 6% of that of the US. Now it's 75%. And in PPP, the GDP of China has overtook the US one in 2014, and it's now 20% bigger. China, really what it's done is has changed the paradigm. The previous paradigm was a planned economy plus a communist dictatorship equals misery. Market economy plus supposed democracy equals wealth. That was true in the former Soviet Union. in Eastern Socialist Europe and in Mao's China. But Deng's China broke that paradigm. The communism of the the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe failed for a simple reason, because it was able to give its population a dignified living conditions. And I'll explain that in a very short anecdote that I've personally experienced. My wife is Russian. We married in 1980. In 1981, 92, her sister came to visit us in Madrid. We go to El Corte Inglés, at this department store, and my sister-in-law went in through the door and started just crying. And she said, why don't we have this in Moscow? Why don't we have a Corte Inglés in Moscow instead of having GU in the Red Square next to the Kremlin and the GU? I don't know if you've ever seen the GU. There was nothing in GU. When the Soviet Union went into the El Corte Inglés, the communist ideology just crashed to the floor. They never believed anymore in the communist ideology because it was unable to give people a living standard that was dignified. There's a joke that says the Soviet Union, and there were all sorts of jests, the KGB was always making jokes. And the joke goes, this year, one fridge for each member of the public. Next year it'll be a car. And the next year it'll be a plane for each. We'll be able to go from Moscow to go and buy toilet roll. There was nothing. It was incredible. That was just a joke. Anyway.
Evidentemente esta ruptura.
Obviously, this break in paradigm has given the Communist Party in China an immense legitimacy, immense technology. If we really simplify, China was one of the first in world technology for centuries and centuries. You have Joseph Mira's book from Cambridge of half a century ago, and there continues to be an institute in Cambridge that continues to publish it. And it's a science and civilization in China. And Francis Bacon said the Renaissance in Europe would have been impossible with the compass, print, and gunpowder. China, for a reason that is not that well known, closes and loses its technological creativity existing for many years. It loses the train of the Industrial Revolution, and therefore there's still ships from the UK that are fighting against its ships, and China suffers humiliation. We could never insist enough on what this century of humiliation means in the collective conscience of China. China learns the lesson and says, well, if you are not at the technological avant-garde, the countries that are can subject you. Therefore, when now the US is saying, we're going to reduce you to a second level technology country with a quantum technology, AI, and so on. What is the way in which China sees it? You want to leave me once again in the same position I was in when I lost the train of the Industrial Revolution? And from there onwards, and from this vulnerability, they decide they can put their foot on your neck whenever they want to. So nor China, nor any other power can be in a second division in technology. If the US achieves or not to leave China at this second level is something that you will know when you are still here 10, 20, or 30 years from now. If you ask me about my view, I have the same view that Bill Gates has. China is unstoppable right now. The only thing you do by treating China as an enemy is to make it an enemy. Regarding the relationship between China and the US, Xi Jinping said in March that America wants to suffocate China financially, and then China wants to be at the first economic level, secondly at a first military level, and then become those that will dominate the world. And Biden has said that this will not happen when he's in the White House. So if he wins the next election, he says this won't happen. The other side believes that the counterparty is going against their needs, and they both have fear, lack of trust, obsession for security, and some paranoia. The core of everything in the conflict is Taiwan. And I'm not going to speak about Taiwan today because I don't have the time. But if you ask me about this later on, I will be very pleased to speak about Taiwan. Both sides have made mistakes, and both sides are to blame, like in all conflicts, or most of them. In the US, the majority agrees in which that they have to stop China financially. However they can. They started with a pilot with Obama. And Biden has maintained this, and in fact has added an ideological element, that is democracy against authoritarian countries, and in fact is trying to create a NATO in the Pacific. India has said no already, but that's what they're trying to do. One of the a person from the Trump government said that a war is unavoidable. Let's have this war when we're able to win it. In fact, if you accept as a premise that China is an enemy, and you take into account what China is going to be by half of this century, that is an economy that can be even 50% bigger than that of the US, it's almost unavoidable to reach that conclusion. That is, let's fight this war when we can still win it. In the US, however, not everyone sees this in the same way. There is a minority in my way of seeing things, a correct minority, an enlightened minority. And this is reflected in the letter published on the 3rd of July of the year 19 that says China is not an enemy, signed by 100 of the most brilliant people regarding security and foreign policy in the US. In this letter, they say China is not an existential threat for the national security of the US. The economic decoupling with China would be negative for the US and for the world economy. The American allies are not going to continue, and the US has the risks of being isolated. The fear of China wanting to replace the US as a global leader is exaggerated. It's not clear that this is a necessary or possible aim for China. And finally, the US says should bring China to participate in a new global order. The ideological conflict. For 40 years, The US didn't mind China being a dictatorship because it's always been so, or that they didn't respect human rights in the way in which the West understands it. They didn't care. This is what happens with Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So what's happened with Franco's Spain? So human rights are used when it is convenient, and not used when it's not convenient. In fact, what happened with Japan? Japan never threatened in GDP the US, but they were a threat regarding technology in the 70s and 80s. At that time, they stopped the progress in semiconductors of Japan, and the agreements of the year 85 imposed a reassessment, which was one of the mistake, and this on top of other financial mistakes meant the situation in which Japan is now. So how was it useful for Japan to become a democracy? Because when they were seen as a threat, they were stopped. It was an American protectorate. So even though if China was a perfect democracy, if the GDP figures and technological progress of China is what it is, exactly the same thing would happen. That is, human rights, democracy, and so on and so forth. It's a rationalization of other things, because the problem is the projections for China. And allow me to add a couple of things on China and the Ukraine war. In the West, we say, well, China should exercise all of its power to stop Russia. But exercise its power would mean what? China saying to Russia, either you stop this invasion and leave Ukraine, or you will not have a relationship with China anymore, or even saying China is going to sanction you. To expect this is not realistic. Why? Because when the US is attempting to stop China, Russia is the most important country for China. Without Russia, their containment will always be precarious or even impossible. In the 60s, when China and Russia were fighting each other in the border, they had 50 divisions and 700,000 men there, and China had more than 800,000. So if Russia needed this 50 divisions in the border, could it have done what it's doing in Ukraine? If China needed 800,000 soldiers, would they have time and people to do what they're doing? So the understanding between China and Russia means avoiding the war into France. And from the financial standpoint, China receives from Russia limited energy and raw materials. It also receives it from countries in Central Europe through Russia, through line. So it avoids the Malacca Strait. And in fact, if things go bad, the American army would stop this trade. The American Navy would do so, but this is avoided. How can the Silk Route exist without having China? It would be or without having Russia for China. That would be impossible. And there's something else that I believe is very important. Russia, even though it's not doing well in the war, has a great technological capacity too. And China is very strong in science. And China is making a great effort in this science. So there has to be a capacity to be avant-garde, and science and Russia is very important. The Bauma University in Moscow, which would be the equivalent to MIT in the US, or is the great technology university in Russia. Up to a few years ago, Russia wouldn't give anything to China, but now they provide them with absolutely everything. A few weeks ago, Bauman has opened a university in Shenzhen, and when they talk about this non-limit friendship of China and Russia, of course, the military side is present, but amongst other things, they talk about this issues like energy, technology, and remembering that Putin said a few years back that whoever is first in AI would be the leader. So I will stop here, and I believe that's the reason why Russia is for China the most important country. A couple things on Europe, and then I will finish with this. Giuseppe, in an article published recently, a few months back, said that Europe doesn't want to block the emergency of any country, but wants for this emergency to not attack its interests, values, and international order based on the rules. Interests, first of all. The interest, we have the American decoupling, which at the end of the day is a way of going against the world economy to stop China. It's as simple as that. The US has seen that the allies are not supporting them. If we talk about the 25% of GDP that is foreign trade, in Europe it's more than double. Scholz goes to Peking last year and says no decoupling and no new Cold War. Germany has more than 1 million jobs, direct jobs that have to do with their exports to China. A few months back, Macron goes back and says exactly the same thing. No decoupling at all. The big business world in the US doesn't want to hear about this. The leaders of the big semiconductors companies have said that 30% of their business is in China. So if you stop this for me, I won't have money for R&D. And Bill Gates has said we won't stop China. In fact, we are stimulating them to create their own advanced industry, and therefore we lose what we had if we were the ones selling it to them. But now China is having to create this industry, and it's unstoppable, as Bill Gates said. The big Guiders, Secretary of the Treasury of a few years back in the US, said we're doing this wrong by attempting to cut the financial relationship with China. This will go against the American interests. So the US has felt that they've had to correct this policy that was destroying the world economy, starting with the blockage of the WTO. So they've have turned not 180 degrees but 90 degrees, and they go from decoupling to de-risking, and some will try to make it the same thing with a different name or title, but Europe has had a great influence on this. Both Europe and the business world in the US, which makes the US open its eyes. And secondly, regarding what Giuseppe was saying regarding values, I briefly mentioned this. We can do two things about this. We can say in public and private to China, that's what we've done through critical dialogue. For 12 years, I've been an ambassador in China. I've been in the discussion to send our report to Brussels, and in the two previous Spanish presidencies, I've been responsible for the report. And whenever we wanted to condemn China in UN bodies, we've failed, because in a democratic voting, China always has the vote to stop this. So we're never able to even discuss if we're going to condemn them. So with your those that think in a different way, you can criticize either in public or private and continue with the relationship, or you can say no. If you don't change all of this, then there won't be a relationship between us. And then you block a relationship. And this is something that Europe cannot do, nor anyone. And finally, regarding the international order based on rules, Josep correctly said in his article, says that they have to reach the maximum consensus. But it cannot be that international order today is the same as in the year 45, when America dictated that order, and they had half of the global GDP. You cannot, after 40, when you're 40 years old, you cannot wear what you wore when you were 10 years old. So things have changed, and we need to change things because of that. And finally, the strategic autonomy demanded by Europe. Europe either is a partner in a new Cold War and a new bilateral order next to the US, or they can be a sovereign institution in a multipolar order. The Ukraine war has shown that Europe is a American protectorate, and the quid pro quo derived from them is very simple. The US says, well, Europe, I will help you against those that you believe are your main enemy, and in fact you will help me against my first enemy, which is China. So Europe up till now doesn't want to say yes to this, and this issue will be the core issue regarding strategic autonomy for Europe. 3 years ago, the former Prime Minister from Italy, Letta, here in this same room and in this same table, sitting right here, said, yes, in 10, 15 years, if European countries don't progress towards a political union, the only alternative that they will have is one by one to decide if they want to be colonies of the US or of China. That's exactly what he said. Unfortunately, the political union that some of us would like so much is not present. Germany talks about this, and it's part of the SPD program by Scholz. But Macron talks about this, but never ends saying it clearly. And Schäuble, the German, said that when we created the euro, the idea was to be together politically, and France never wanted it, and that's why it doesn't exist. It's as simple as that. And I will finish with this. With this qualitative jump in the EU is not possible. There seems to be an open door if France and Germany agree on this, will be on a reinforced cooperation. And therefore, Eastern Europe, and in fact the Polish minister said that Europe is a dictatorship of French and Germany, and no one is going to leave veto power aside. So these countries look more towards Washington than Brussels. So we have a new concentric circle that would divide even more Europe, and I will change. The other side of the strategic autonomy is, of course, the moderating power. Right here in Santander, In Santander, Josep Borrell said something that I believe is really significant, and that is that the US believes that the conflict with China is unavoidable, and possibly China believes the same thing, and we Europeans have to avoid this happening with the power of moderating. We've already done this with America and decoupling. So if the US and China do not find a modus vivendi and a coexistence, a peaceful coexistence to bring peace to the world, the economic prosperity and therefore the solution of big collective problems, starting with climate change, won't be possible. Thank you, and sorry for taking a few more minutes of your time. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes. I would like to know if the High Representative has any reaction to this presentation.
Bueno, pues entonces empezamos.
Then we can start with the Q&A. I think we can have a first Q&A round for 15 minutes, and then after listening to Mr. Seibert, we can continue. I have 3 questions. We will start at the back of the room.
Gracias. Buenos días. Mi nombre es...
Good morning, I am Noelia, and I have a degree in Chinese and Russian literature and language, and I also have a master's on European studies. Thank you so much for such a clarifying presentation. My question is, up to what point is the European initiative of the Global Gateway an alternative that is powerful enough compared to the new Silk Route for China, or as Mr. Bragolat mentioned, treating China as an enemy will make it an enemy, and in fact they are unstoppable. So wouldn't it be feasible to see how the EU could participate and arbitrate the projects of this Belt and Road? And how is this initiative going to help us regarding debt, investments, and that way counterpart the influence of China in the European territory?
Marcelino Cabrera ha pedido la palabra.
Gracias.
Thank you. I am Marcelino Cabrera, researcher from the EU, former researcher from the EU. I would like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentations full of details and nuances. It was a lesson for me. There are so many things that differentiate us from China, I mean the EU, that I would just take one that has to do with the technology change, which is AI. The perspective that we have and the difference in perspective regarding artificial intelligence is paradigmatic. There are other differences, of course, for example, regarding climate change, that in fact for me is problem number 1. I agree with the ambassador, and beyond the hypes regarding AI, around humanity committing suicide because of AI, I believe these are just hypes, but this can happen if we do not do anything regarding climate change. So the differences in perspective, as I was saying, in AI are pragmatic. Here in Europe, we want an AI and an innovation of AI that is ethical. Nothing brings us further away from China than this. I believe that in AI we can have such a big gap between us and China, but also it could be a great way of coming together if we want to integrate China in a new global order, as the ambassador mentioned. I believe the professor from the Canadian University could add this issue of AI to your list of unknowns that you had at the end of your presentation. I don't know if you want to... sorry, there's one third question and then we will go to the answers. Well, there are two things that really concern me. If China is going to be able to maintain two regimes inside one same state, and regarding the technological revolution and a human revolution, if it's going to maintain its dictatorship. My second question is China going to be able to be pragmatic with Taiwan, or do you believe there will be a conflict with the US? I think we can start with these three questions, I believe he said, because he was not using the microphone. Thank you.
Okay. La última pregunta sobre la relación.
The final question about technology in the political system. Well, technology in China now helps the party to keep and strengthen its position of power. China, of course. That was very different in Hu Jintao's time. In Hu Jintao's time, there was a question about how to use social media. Social media were a threat.
Okay, let's fully embrace them to make use of them politically, so to be stronger. And now China does not only want to reinforce technology on its territory for political purposes, but to export them also to help other governments to be stronger politically, government with a one-party system. I think this is very important because China, you know, is providing training programs, providing for free engineers, for free technological hardware and software to developing countries to just share its experience. Xi Jinping is talking about a Chinese modernization. And that's very important because for a long time, said, well, China does not want to export its model. China does not use the term model, but it wants clearly to export its model. We have enough evidence of this through declaration, but also facts. China considers that the ideological war that is taking place is not only to reject and put out of the territory the Western hostile forces. As you know, China has been putting away from its territory a significant number of journalists, of researchers, of media, including from Europe, but also it considers that the global fight for ideology is taking place globally, meaning that you have to really limit the influence of Western values and use the technologies that are existing, including using the weaknesses of our democracies to accelerate our decline. And that, I think, we don't really assess the strength and depth of the ideological competition that is going here. China has been meticulously and regularly underlying our weaknesses publicly and pointing at the fact that we are responsible of all crises. We, including European, I say the West, because China considers the West is a big box. Of course, there is some differences, but we are part of this big box. So it is saying that, you remember that battle of narratives, I mean, during COVID, we were responsible, so-called, for lack of solidarity among EU member states. We are so-called responsible for food security and energy security across the world because of the Ukraine crisis that we would have generated. We would be responsible for inequalities in the world. And in this condition, we still consider that China does not see us as an enemy. Whatever you consider China as an enemy or not. I mean, policymakers, it's their job to decide, to choose, or not even to choose. But China considers us as an enemy. That's a fact under Xi Jinping. China as a CPC, not the people, of course, but CPC considered as an enemy, and emphasizes it regularly on its media every day, not only on its domestic media, but globally. And in that case, I think it's a mistake not to fully take the measure of the ideological rivalry that is taking place, because China is joining forces with Russia, because the messages are naturally converging. And they start to impact really the dynamics of the debate at international organization. I will go back to the question, Global Gateway. As you know, before the Global Gateway was issued, there was a paper on connecting Asia and Europe 5 years ago. It was actually a strategic reflection that was shaped at EU level following the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think really the BRI has this, I would say, positive consequences that it pushed us to think strategically about infrastructure, not just transport infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. But I mean, we are heading to what I call bi-globalization. Bi-globalization meaning two sets of norms, of technologies, of way to use these technologies, and that are not compatible. I mean, that's partly due to, of course, the tit-for-tat tech tension between China and the US, but also that's due to the fact that China considers that more and more it needs to be less dependent on foreign technology as a whole, not just American technology, but also European technologies. Of course, there is some strong interaction and partnership still, but in the long term, China has put forward a plan that is called 10,000 Little Giants. These 10,000 Little Giants state that China should have its own, should be fully autonomous in its technological production chain. For example, ASLM should be Chinese. China should have its own ASML company. It should not depend on foreign actors in production chains of technologies that I consider strategic. A point that I wanted to go back that was raised on the economy, it's up to policymakers, again, to decide about the nature of economic relationship with China. I'm French, and being based in Paris, I hear a lot of feedbacks from French companies, major French companies, including some that were heavily present on the Chinese market over decades, some that were extremely enthusiastic, some that had kept personal contact at the highest political level, and they are, vast majority of them now, pessimistic about the future and opportunities and the presence on the Chinese market. They're very pessimistic, and the personal ties that they had built at the highest level does not weigh much in the long term. That's why I disagree with a lot of respect with Jean Monnet. But I build personal trust relation. I am for being nice with people, and we are all. But in the end, you can be friend with a Chinese researcher in a think tank for 10 years. In the end, when the CPC is monitoring everyone and says that the party commissaire is watching, they are watching. The political context is so much hardening in China that human relationship does not weigh much in front of institutional constraint and political watch and monitoring. I think we underestimate the level of political hardening in China. It is hardening to a level that we have never seen before. We can compare with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and it's not stopping. And in the end, whatever we think, we say, okay, maybe we should not care about dissent and people arrested in China, but even if we don't care, and I think we should care, because it's part of the DNA of the EU, but even in that case, it poses significant problem on our own European territories in terms of monitoring of dissent, Chinese dissent on EU member states, in terms of freedom of expression in universities, in media, and even, as you mentioned Hong Kong, big capitalists, owners of companies in Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai is arrested and is still in prison. The level of hardening in Hong Kong should, I think, make us consider also policy option leading to human solution in front of serious crisis that can happen overnight, diplomatic crisis. I'm thinking, of course, of the two Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, Canadian citizens that were arrested in China. This could happen with European citizens. And I think it will only continue because China is ready to pay the price of its political stability, even pay the price economically. I stay up here.
2 minutos antes de que cambiemos la...
2 minutes before we change our setup and invite our guest from the European Commission.
What Ali said, I'll just then address 2 questions. Noelia, right? The question on the Silk Road and BRI. I'll just add to what was said that the BRI, which is very interesting, it's a very broad universe of cases, you know, when you study all the cases, and they cover a big spectrum, some of which are benign or doing okay, and many of which are not, right, and are you know, not very well thought through projects that will not then backfire. But it has created a lot of movement around infrastructure, and indeed it has had competitive pressure for the EU to step up, for Japan to step up. Japan was already the #1 in South Asia and has done a lot. And I know the US is stepping up, the G7 is stepping up. So there's a good aspect of it because there was a gap in infrastructure. The hope is that this competition indeed can be managed. You know, competition can lead to good outcomes for many countries, but has to be managed and contained. So I'm optimistic on the gateway. It's a great start. Has to be stepped up further, and often in cooperation with partners. To Marcelino Cabrina, I forgot the name right, on AI. So I'll just say yes, yes. You notice I put AI several times, and I would agree it should be in the list. It's a huge issue. We have huge differences with China. And yet, I do know from listening to some of the long-term philosophers or long-term thinkers that we will not be able to manage AI for humanity without cooperation. You know, even between EU and US is not easy on AI. Even between companies, you know, in the US, they're fighting very hard with each other. And it's going to have to include China at some point. Otherwise, we will have a very hard time making sure that this competition and development of AI is serving humanity. We'll have to find some bridge. And then for a person in front on Taiwan, I would say the game is completely open. Nothing is set yet. It's very interactive, but it's a delicate status quo. It's a very fragile thing that we were left by, you know, Zhou Enlai and Kissinger. It requires a degree of, you know, it's the combination of 3 things: deterrence, so more deterrence to make sure the cost of invading Taiwan is high, more diplomatic engagement, and then a degree of forbearance, especially on the political side, by especially the US and of course China. And so that remains to be seen how long they will maintain any forbearance. And then you know, the Taiwanese politics also play a huge role. So it's a very dynamic domain. It's not set. There are potential bad scenarios, but there's a lot of stable ones as well. So I remain optimistic, but it's very hard to know.
Bueno, yo creo, Eugenio, te daré la palabra en primer lugar, pero estamos ya esperando para la conexión. Después seguimos, sí, sí.
I think somebody's going to have to decide when to cut us off. We're going to stay here because we haven't got the time to make an introduction, so we're just going to stay where we are.